All right, it looks like our numbers have slowed down here. So I just want to welcome everyone to Forward Together, where science, ethics, and religion intersect in a changing world. This is the breakout session on evolution. My name is John Slattery, and I'm a senior program associate with the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion, where I primarily work with the Science for Seminaries project and with other projects as well. And I'll be the moderator of this session today. So before we start, a reminder that closed captioning is available for this session. You may click the live captioning button at the bottom of your screen to turn captions on or off and adjust settings. There will also be a time for questions near the end, so we invite you to enter your questions using the Q&A button throughout the session. You may also upvote others' questions. Also, a reminder, the session is being recorded. So this topic of evolution obviously is a large topic within discussions of religion and science. We're not going to cover every single aspect of that topic today, but we do hope that this conversation we're able to address some pressing questions and spur some great conversation among our two panelists today. So our two panelists today, I'm only going to introduce very briefly, and then I'm going to let them talk about themselves. First, we have Dr. Levi Morran, who's Associate Professor at the Department of Biology at Emory University. And we also have Dr. Briana Pobiner, a Paleoanthropologist with the Smithsonian Institution National Museum of Natural History. And so that's all I'm going to say right now. And we're just going to open it up so we have lots of time for good conversation today. And so, Dr. Morran, I'm going to ask you to kick us off today.
Excellent. Thank you very much, John and DoSER for putting this on and for having me here. I really appreciate it. Thank you all for coming to hear what we have to say and asking us questions. So as John said, I'm Levi Morran. I'm an evolutionary biologist at Emory University. I run a research lab, and I consider myself what's called an experimental evolutionist. So in my lab, we actually we run experiments and actually watch evolution play out in real time. And so in my lab, just across the hall right now, we have bacteria and microscopic worms that are evolving in different ways. And we're testing evolutionary theory in real time. A lot of the questions that my lab pursues concern sort of co-evolutionary dynamics. So how do mutualisms evolve? How do host parasite and disease relationships evolve? And a lot of that is sort of centered around actually understanding why sexual reproduction evolved in the first place and why sex sticks around so much. In terms of sort of the science-religion interface, that's a topic that I'm very interested in, very passionate about. I've been working with DoSER here for about 3 years now. And it's something that, I think personally I have experience with. And then beyond that, here in Atlanta, I run actually a science day camp where we teach about evolution in a church setting. So we're actually partnered with a church here through an outreach with NSF where we talk about evolution, teach evolution to kids in that church community. So that's all I'll say for now, and I'll kick it over here.
All right, thank you, Levi. So I'm Briana Pobiner, and as mentioned before, I work at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History in the Human Origins program. I also actually teach at George Washington University in the Center for the Advanced Study of Human Paleobiology. And so I'm a paleoanthropologist. I study human evolution, and I'm particularly interested in the evolution of human diet. And the way that I study that is by looking at fossils that have traces like butchery marks left by early humans when they ate those animals. And that's my data that I collect basically to answer my big questions about when meat eating started and why that happened and all of that kind of thing. So I started at the Smithsonian as a pre-doctoral and then a postdoctoral fellow, but then I transitioned into a permanent position, including putting together the permanent Hall of Human Origins, which really led to my interest in public engagement with science and the science-religion interface and thinking about who the visitors are that will be walking through the halls of our museum. So now part of my job responsibilities are leading all of the education and outreach efforts for the Smithsonian's Human Origins Program. And that includes everything from helping to train public-facing volunteers who are really on the front lines of interacting with visitors, facilitating public programs. We have, usually when the museum is open, we have a couple of programs, informal programs every month right in the Hall of Human Origins. I also help with our online outreach, including our website content and social media accounts. And then maybe about a decade ago, I started getting interested in studying the teaching and learning of evolution in high school biology classrooms. And so now I'm on my second big National Science Foundation grant, which is developing curriculum materials and kind of teaching strategies for teachers in some communities where it's less comfortable to teach about evolution. And how might that work? And how might teaching evolution through human examples actually really engage high school students? The other thing I've been involved with is that we now have a small traveling exhibit, kind of a scaled down version of our permanent Hall of Human Origins at the Natural History Museum that has gone to public libraries. So starting in 2015, for 2 years, the exhibit went to 19 public libraries across the US. Which was an amazing experience working with the American Library Association. And we did public programs and some private programs in those libraries. I led a workshop for teachers, and we also had a private tour and discussion for religious leaders and clergy in all of those communities. In the Human Origins Program, we have an advisory group on science and society topics called our Broader Social Impacts Committee, including other folks that have worked with DoSER in the past. And my other involvement with DoSER in general is I am the advisor for some evolution content being developed for the curriculum for Wesley Theological Seminary. So I will also stop there, and then we can kick off the discussion.
Well, that was perfect. I didn't have to send you time reminders or anything like that. So that was really impressed about your conciseness there. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a conversation here for a little while, and then we'll open it up to general Q&A. But just to get our conversation going, I'd really love to hear about maybe just one or two significant interactions you had with the dialogue with religious communities and talking about evolution, maybe some interactions you had that sort of helped to form how you think about that dialogue today. And Dr. Pobiner, I'll start with you, if that's okay.
Sure. And so I guess one interaction really stands out for me, and this was on our library tour across the US, and I wish I remember which library this was, but I was giving a tour of our traveling human evolution exhibit to a group of librarians, and there was a kid who I think was high school age who came into the library just doing his homework and didn't know any of this was going on, but I noticed him starting to listen pretty intently as I was giving this tour. And after the tour ended, he approached me and said, "Hey, can I ask you a couple of questions?" And I said, "Sure." And so some of the questions he was asking me were clearly questions that I had sort of seen or heard before that were kind of typical anti-evolution worldview questions, but he seemed to be really genuinely struggling with a lot of this and had a lot of curiosity. And so I spent quite a bit of time, talking with him and figuring out where his trepidation came from. And at the end of the conversation, he just looked at me and said, "Well, thank you. I've never had an opportunity to ask anybody these questions." And I just thought, making space where these questions can be asked is probably one of the most important things we can do in order to further any kind of conversation about the science-religion interface, just making a safe space for these kinds of conversations.
That's great. Thank you so much for that. Dr. Morran, throw it to you.
Yeah, so actually I would say for me, there was an interaction along these lines that basically made me an experimental evolutionist. So when I was very young, I grew up in a very conservative church, and while I love those folks and consider them very much my family, I was taught very early on that evolution was not legitimate, that it was a deception, and so then I became interested in biology because I think biology is fascinating, and I'm curious about the world around us. And so I started learning in college about evolution, and started to see that evolution wasn't this thing that happened a long time ago. I mean, it did, but it's also still continuing today. And when I figured out that, we could use math, we could use direct observation to actually see evolution in real time, I became really, really curious. And so I just decided, you know what, like I'm going to join a lab and I'm going to find out if evolution is a thing. And so I, as an undergrad, started doing experimental evolution and really got fascinated with it. And I remember the first day after seeing my data and seeing like, oh, things actually evolved in the lab. I remember laying in bed that night thinking like, well, I guess I can't have religious faith anymore because I've seen evolution play out. And in that moment, I just remember thinking, well, that's ridiculous because I don't feel any different about my faith. Like that, this hasn't changed anything. And so, so as a result of that, really, I will say I spend a lot of time talking to undergraduates in my evolutionary biology class so that they don't have that same sort of misconception about things. And most of my sort of favorite conversations as a teacher have sort of come out of just talking about that with students that are concerned about what they think about things and how to reconcile faith and science.
Thanks so much for that. I want to sort of, well, actually, real quick, I want to pause and remind people that they can put questions into the Q&A box, and feel free to put them in now, even though we're not at the Q&A session yet. You can also upvote other people's questions that you think are similar to your own. All right, with that said, I want to sort of drill into that point that both of you made there, which is the importance of making a safe space to talk about these issues. And, based upon that, I would love to hear, maybe elaboration on that, and also some other challenges or sort of best practices that religious communities, could implement when wanting to talk about these issues of evolution, or just another way to think about it, some of the biggest challenges that religious communities face in dealing with evolution and anything around the topic of evolution. So Dr. Morran, you want to start us off there?
I definitely can. I will say Briana probably has far more interesting things than I on the topic, but I'll kick us off here. So for me, I think the real challenge on the religious community side here is being inclusive and just and not turning people away. And I'll say from my personal experience and just sort of seeing things play out in multiple religious communities, I think the issue is not so much whether people agree with each other, but I think it is creating that space for people to have these discussions, basically making it safe for people to ask questions, to sort of question other people's thinking, or even just to say, what their thoughts are, and creating that space for exploration. I think that's going to make healthier communities in the long run. And I also think, where religious faith is really strong is a faith that people question and they explore, and so that's my 2 cents. I'll kick it over to Briana here.
Yeah, this is a great question. And so I was going to say, I probably have less to say on this in a sense. So I grew up in a conservative Jewish community. And so conservative is really middle of the road for Judaism. And now I'm Reform, which is the most liberal of the kind of 3 main branches of Judaism. So, when I was growing up, there wasn't any conflict between science and religion. And so I've had to learn about what the roots of these conflicts are for religious communities. And so my sense is that it's really, I think for many religious people, and particularly I think for younger people of faith, it's really the topics of interest in where that science and faith might intersect, where it's about values, where it's about ethics, but where those things touch on science, and what science brings to the table in people making, life choices. And so I think in some ways, I do think it still comes back to being able to create a place where different viewpoints are heard and honored and respected, even if people don't agree on all interpreting scripture a particular way or thinking a particular way. Just the idea that there can be this diversity of viewpoints and feelings about something, and that's okay, and that is encouraged, I think is maybe something to strive for.
I think that that's absolutely right. I mean, so much of what we do at DoSER is sort of trying to listen to lots of different viewpoints and encouraging those same conversations, which you've both been talking about. Now, I'm curious. Now we're talking about religious communities. Let's talk for a second about the scientific community. Where do you see? I mean, you're both well within the scientific community and have been for many years. What challenges do you see there? What opportunities do you see there? And how do you see this same conversation happening on that side of things? So Dr. Pobiner, we'll start back with you.
Yeah, this is a question that I enjoy thinking about. And so I think, there's a few challenges on the scientific community side. One is that, there have been great studies by Elaine Eklund and others, who's a sociologist, that there is a lower proportion of people of religious faith in the sciences. So I think as scientists are engaging with the public, if they're college professors, they're less likely to be people of religious faith. And so they're less likely to be able to relate to students and other folks and be able to make that kind of connection. So I think just even knowing what the issues are is a challenge. The second challenge is that I think in many ways, although I do see a really welcome change in the scientific community, I think the approach of the scientific community has always been the information deficit model. We just need to give people more science and they will love it and embrace us and everything will be fine. And that is not how it works. There's lots of great studies that that's not a great model for trying to convince somebody of a particular scientific viewpoint or to, engage them with the scientific evidence. And so I think, models where scientists are not models of engagement where scientists are not the only people of intellect and value in the room, and having really genuine, honest, respectful conversations where scientists are interested in what is troubling someone, what are the obstacles, how can we make connections to overcome them. It's not something that we learn in graduate school. So I think that they're recognizing that this is important and of value if we want to create a science-friendly, let alone a science-literate citizenry. I think this is really important.
And I'll just say I wholeheartedly agree with everything there. And to build off of the second point, I think it's really important for scientists to recognize that science can't answer everything. And I think it's easy to get trapped in this mindset when you work in science, because science answers most of the questions that you are pursuing on a daily basis. But I think it's really easy to forget that some of these really big questions in life, what is the meaning of life? Why are we here? Science can't touch any of that, and it's important to keep science, within the realms of science. And I think that is so key for the scientific community to recognize. And I think that's also why it's important for scientists to recognize that, that scientists can't always be sort of just feeding more information. There does need to be people that have thought about these bigger questions and able to sort of take some science, but apply it to some of those big questions. And so I think within science, we just basically need to appreciate other fields for their ability to answer questions, outside of science. It can be equally important to the human experience. The other thing that I will say is I have been very pleasantly surprised by how open and welcoming the evolutionary biology community has been to really anyone of faith. But what I will say is I direct the graduate program for ecology and evolution here at Emory, and I still see students come into our program that are hesitant to talk about their faith. That they have this faith, they think, maybe I shouldn't talk about this around other scientists. I'm not sure if people will be comfortable with that. And so I think within science, not just people's religious background, but every possible kind of level of diversity, science just has to be more open about being inclusive there. And I think I want to believe that deep down, the roots are strong there, but we need to be more open about that and to be more inviting to people coming in. Really the same as my answer to the religious community side of things.
That's totally fine. I mean, I think that's a great theme that we're hitting on here. As you both know, and as I'm sure many people in the audience know here, I mean, evolution has been one of the most controversial topics around this conversation around religion and science I mean, since The Descent of Man was published, since The Origin of Species, and even before that. So having this approach that doesn't just say, as Dr. Pobiner was saying, oh, here's new science to give out. You just don't know all the facts yet. It's not enough. It's not enough to be able to actually have these conversations and have this open and honest dialogue. So I really appreciate both of your insights on that. I want to shift a little bit and just talk about, you've both been around this conversation for a long time and really done excellent engagement here. What are some pieces within the field of evolution that you think are going to be really important for this conversation over the next couple of years that we should be on the lookout for, or if we're not already attuned to, we should read up on a little bit so we can anticipate these questions before they arise. So Dr. Morran, I'll start back with you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, in the midst of this pandemic, we are all sort of very keenly aware of the implications of evolution going forward, particularly as it relates to COVID-19. And so I think we need to be very vigilant, very aware of the evolutionary consequences for disease going forward, without a doubt. And I think, that starts with funding in the basic sciences, and it goes all the way up to very applied public health measures. Beyond that, I think as we sort of move forward here, this sort of push for individualized medicine and understanding sort of how all of our genomes may interact differently for treatments, for health treatments going forward. I think that matters a great deal, and it's sort of understanding kind of why our genomes are the way they are, how they got to be that way, and what that means going forward. I think that's a huge piece where evolutionary biology is going to influence our lives moving beyond that. And that also sort of touches on what I was saying in the sense that science can't answer all of these questions, because I think as we move towards this individualized medicine model, there's some major ethical questions that we need to deal with there. And as scientists, we're not equipped to answer those questions in an appropriate manner. And so I think that's where we need things like religion, ethics to come in and help us out.
Yeah, I guess I would build on thinking about genomics. And, one of probably the biggest question in human evolution is like, what makes us human and what makes us unique? And the more that we learn about modern human genomes and the more samples we get of ancient human genomes from fossils, it's, when did we become human? What does that look like? How are we different from the ancient human species on the family tree, all of which are now extinct? It's just us. Why did we survive? How are we the last two-legged humans left standing? This species that is now incredibly successful from an evolutionary perspective across the planet. So I guess and a little bit thinking about, and I fully agree with the answer about kind of personalized genomics and medicine and things like that, but also even thinking about what does that mean for relatedness? What does it mean for people's interest in genealogy, but also what does that mean for modern human diversity? We are an incredibly not diverse species. If you think about how many of us are on the planet, we are really genetically similar. Are there ways that we can think about that message of genetic unity while still celebrating the beautiful diversity of all people across the planet? How do we capitalize on and think about that deep unity of all humanity and make that a really important message?
Yeah, those are such huge issues that everyone is starting to think about, and I appreciate your insight and how they look going forward, talking about ethics and medicine and disease, as well as talking about what does it mean to be human. And I'm not an anthropologist myself, but I can't help seeing article after article come out almost every month with new discoveries in the field of hominid research and paleoanthropology. So it's really an exciting time to even be sort of watching this field unfold. And so it'll certainly be a key point as we go forward in the future. All right, we only have time for sort of one more question before we open it up to the audience. And I just want to give you a chance to sort of, maybe just lift up one example. How about, I'll do it this way. What is sort of, we're talking a lot about sort of the safe spaces that people can make within their communities to have these conversations. What's one sort of tangible step that you've seen someone do, that you've done yourself, that really helps to create this space where people feel comfortable talking about some of these really difficult or tricky pieces to talk about within this conversation? Oh, and Dr. Pobiner, I'll start back with you.
Okay, sounds good. I think the thing that I always go to first is we have to start with listening. A thing that I will often, if I'm walking through the Hall of Human Origins at the Smithsonian, which I can't wait to do again after we open on Friday to the public, just listening to people's conversations. And I've had, conversations with visitors who aren't comfortable with the topic. And one thing I'll often say is, tell me more about that. Because it's usually not the first thing that's on the surface. It's really something that's deeper and underneath. And so I think making sure that we can figure out where the pain points are and how we can possibly alleviate some of that. How can we make connections to people? How can we find commonalities? It has to start with listening, I think.
I'll just echo Dr. Pobiner on that one. I think asking questions is super key. And, in some sense, I haven't found a way to sort of connect, to sort of connect with people on a mass level. I think it almost has to be some sort of personal connection that you have there. And so I think, some of the strongest connections I've been able to make are with my students in the classroom, or, people in religious communities that I'm interacting with, pretty one-on-one. And so I think it has to be at a very local level, and it has to be personal interactions.
Thank you both so much. I think these sort of just reiterate the important things that we're talking about, which is that, this conversation's been had in books over and over and over again, and you can throw information at people all the time, but when it comes to actually dialogue and actually encountering people, there's no substitute for the actual thing. Like you were saying, Dr. Pobiner, just answering the questions of that one student, that makes a huge impact on someone, just because someone is there to actually engage in that conversation. All right, I'm going to turn to some great questions we have so far in the queue. Let's start with this one. It's about resources. Are there any resources you can recommend? Well, of course there's resources, but could you recommend us a couple of resources that can help educators to better present information on evolution, or better engage students in dialogue with evolution in a private or religious school setting?
I can read it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, good. So, for me, one of the most powerful teaching tools that I found is a particular experiment in and of itself. And so there's been a lot of media coverage of this experiment. It's an experimental evolution. Like I said, that's what I think about. It's an experimental evolution project that works with E. coli, so bacteria that evolve really quickly, and it shows a lot of evolution in a very short period of time. And so this is Dr. Rich Linsky's. He calls it the long-term evolution experiment. Rich is at Michigan State University, and if you go to Rich's website, he has lots of different media coverage. There have been multiple sort of PBS specials that have been made of this experiment. And it just does a great job of sort of showing evolution play out in real time, and sort of how evolutionary change takes place on a genetic level, on an ecological level, all across the board. And so usually with my evolutionary biology courses, I will sort of hold that experiment front and center so that the students can really see evolution play out. But that's one little piece. So there are all kinds of things out there.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think in some sense, it depends on the age of students. I've, as I mentioned before, I've had, I'm on my second grant from the National Science Foundation that's creating curriculum for high school biology classes. And so I think some of those could be applicable for college classes as well. Those materials are freely downloadable if you go to bit.ly, and then /teach human evolution. And so we have 4 curriculum units that are using human examples to teach about evolution. 3 touch on natural selection in modern humans, and 1 is about phylogeny and relatedness. But what I think was even a more innovative part of that project, led by Connie Burtka, who used to be at DoSER, is the creation of a resource for teachers that helps to introduce the topic of evolution, not exclusively, but particularly in communities where it may be difficult to talk about. How do you just get students thinking about what are questions that can be answered with scientific evidence? What are science questions and what are other questions? And these questions are all valuable, but can we categorize them? And so, we have 2 classroom activities in that CRS, Cultural and Religious Sensitivity Resource. And so if you walk students through that, it gives them an opportunity to voice any concerns or discomfort. And I think that it's a really powerful thing to just say, kind of, what are you uncomfortable about? What's scary? And let's talk about it. Not that it's necessarily the role of a high school biology teacher to resolve students' personal concerns, but just to create an atmosphere where that kind of conversation can happen. So that's, at least from my perspective, resources that I think we've shown have been useful, and we've done, research on them, and students are really engaged with them.
Perfect. And Dr. Pobiner, if you could just, as we keep going, if you could post the link in the chat there, that would be ideal. So I'm sure there are plenty other resources, as you both mentioned. You can always find more as well at sciencereligiondialogue.org and see DoSER's resources there. And there are many, many places to look to find great resources about evolution conversation online. Another question sort of looks a little at the issue a little bit differently. Someone writes, one of my close colleagues is a high school biology teacher in one of the most progressive counties in the country. And she said there's no way she'll even mention the name Charles Darwin explicitly because of the blowback from parents, which totally surprised me. Is this generally the case in your experience, where teachers are intimidated even in a progressive environment? Anybody want to take this one? Go ahead, Dr. Pobiner.
I'll take this one, since I am a parent of a child in Montgomery County school systems.
Oh, there you go.
And also because in my first project, NSF funded project, developing these resources, we worked with teachers, not in Montgomery County in Maryland, but sort of nearby in Virginia. So one thing to remember is that Montgomery County is actually really big, and so that there's a real diversity of communities in Montgomery County. I would say that this is probably a minority perspective for Montgomery County teachers, for those that I know. However, when I was doing a focus group with students, in a community in Virginia that was like less than an hour's drive from DC, there were students in that focus group from that first project who said, like, well, I'm Catholic and I can't accept evolution. There's no way, I'm religious. And so, as we're sort of just observing, going, but wait, that's not the official stance of the, of Catholic leadership. But I think that I don't think that this is common in more progressive areas, if you want to put it that way. I do think it's quite common. So my current NSF project is exclusively working with teachers in Alabama who are teaching evolution in their high school classrooms, and I'm just thrilled to be working with them all. It's been a fantastic project. But I think that it's really variable based on community, based on particular teachers, based on the school. But there was a great article out recently within the last year or two by Eric Plutzer and Jeannie Scott, and I know there was one more author, and they basically replicated a study of high school biology teachers that was done about a decade before, and they wanted to look at the amount of time that teachers were spending teaching evolution as well as human evolution. And so the amount of time that high school biology teachers are spending teaching evolution has increased by about 25% over the last 10 years. But human evolution, it's increased 60%. And so that was such an encouraging finding. And so I think that, it's a really fantastic article, and I will find it. I would try to find it and put it in the chat while we're talking. But I think that, a lot of it's due to a couple of factors. Some of it is due to simply like younger teachers. Some of it is due to teachers getting really good professional development and having more resources at their fingertips. So I think I'm hopeful about things changing.
Dr. Morran, any thoughts on this one?
Dr. Pobiner is for sure the expert on that one. I have nothing of substance to contribute there.
All right, well, I'll throw, we only have a couple minutes left, but somebody did ask about people opposing vaccines. And since you brought up disease earlier, Dr. Morran, I'd like to throw that one to you. Do you have any insights from your conversations and many dialogues about evolution towards some people's opposition to vaccines, sort of related to this bigger discussion about creation and evolution? Sort of, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think in some level. So I say all this. The CDC is about 100 yards that way, and so as I drive into work, I often will see vaccine protesters outside the CDC and things of that nature. And so I think on some level, there's this problem of misinformation that's being spread, and so I think you have to you have to combat the spread of that misinformation. But beyond that, and what I see with my students, we tend to not talk about vaccines a lot because I'm teaching an evolutionary biology class, but we deal a lot with misconceptions in evolution. So these could be this could be a student who's fully on board with evolution by natural selection, but they have misconceptions about how natural selection proceeds. Like, what are the mechanisms that allow it to occur? Could be lots of different things. People hear a lot about evolution and they get these ideas in their head that are not necessarily 100% accurate. And so what I found over the years of teaching that course is that you have to be very careful about how you combat those misconceptions. It's much like Dr. Pobiner was talking. It's not about just giving them the right information, but I think it's much more about sort of showing them where the misconception goes awry, and then sort of inserting the correct information into that context for them. And so you can't just sort of throw correct information at this problem. It really has to be sort of a reteaching process. And unfortunately, that's pretty involved and that's pretty extreme. But I think if we can sort of stop the spread of misinformation and then also sort of engage people where they are to kind of replace that misinformation with the science, that's what's key. And so obviously, public health is, I think that's one of the major goals of public health, and that's what they're really going for. And I think that is super key going forward.
Thank you so much for that. I didn't even realize you saw protesters right outside. So it was a perfect question for you. Unfortunately, we are out of time in this session, and the next breakout session starts in just 5 minutes. So I want to give attendees a chance to take a short break there before the next one. I want to thank you both so much, Dr. Pobiner and Dr. Morran. This has been a fantastic conversation, and I really, really appreciate your time today. For all of you that are watching, please look them both up, and please reach out to us with further questions and conversations, and see the link in the chat. And just thank you for joining us today and being a part of this conversation. I look forward to having the conversation as we go further in this dialogue. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.